Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to our third episode of Global Crisis, Global Solidarity, a new bi-weekly discussion show hosted by the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung, and it's in the Center of International Dialogue, and we are streaming live from Berlin. The Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung is one of the major political foundations in Germany, promoting political education and scholarly research in the spirit of our namesake, the revolutionary socialist leader Rosa Luxemburg. With offices in 25 countries around the world, we see ourselves as a facilitator of exchange and interaction between labor forces and the left in Germany, Europe, and worldwide. Every first and third Wednesday of the month, Global Crisis, Global Solidarity welcomes thinkers, activists, and partners of the foundation to develop a better understanding of the local, regional, and global aspects of the current health crisis, as well as to take a serious look at what kinds of strategies an internationalist left can offer in response. My name is Fida Alzanin, and I'll be hosting today's episode. And next to me is Lauren Ballhorn. He is an editor at the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung, and today he will be monitoring the chat. So if you would like to be part of our conversation today, please just drop us a line on the chat box on YouTube or in the comments below on Facebook. So Lauren will do his best to include as many questions as he can. Also, do you work as a care worker or as a cleaner or as a health worker? Please tell us about your experience in the chat box. So today we will be talking about when the coronavirus pandemic began to spread across Europe and the United States in February and March of this year. Working from home became the go-to solution to just keep the economy going, and many of us did that to avoid the risk of spreading the infection. Millions of people, including us at the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung, just took their laptops home and avoided coming into the office for months in the interests of the public health. But what about everyone else? Not everyone is able to do that. After all, most of workers, the people who keep our public transport running, who clean our public buildings and city streets, or those who harvest our food, or people who take care of the sick, cannot, of course, take their work home with them. What do employers and governments have to offer for them? So healthcare workers in particular were quickly around the globe acknowledged as essential and thanked with scenes of daily public applause across the cities in Europe and elsewhere. But doctors, nurses, and other care workers from the US, the UK, and elsewhere continue to complain about insufficient protective gear or inadequate wages and lack of support from their respective governments. Not only that, other essential workers, particularly cleaners, have remained largely invisible in the public discourse. So around essential work, this discourse, as crucial as public sanitation is in controlling a pandemic, cleaning workers who take the maximum risk continue to receive the minimum rewards around the globe. This week, we want to shed some light on how numerous injustices that the pandemic exacerbate relate to labor hierarchies. Is clapping for workers, cleaners, and frontline workers really enough? So today, I'm therefore very pleased to welcome today's guest, Mark Bergfeld. Mark is the Director of Property Services and Unicare at Uniglobal Union Europa. He is based in Brussels, Belgium. Mark holds a PhD from Queen Mary University, London, and he has written extensively on migrants, on labor, and social movements. Mark has a regular newsletter on the world of work that we are definitely linking in the chat. So today, we are very pleased to have Mark with us, and we would like to hear more from him. So Mark, like these days, we hear a lot about like the words or sentences, frontline workers, essential workers, a lot referring to cleaners, carers, and domestic workers or workers in the health sector. Like workers that their work has been always undervalued and underpaid. and even sometimes it's not paid at all. And after years of being told that their work is expendable, now they are suddenly told their work is indispensable. So, Mark, as someone who is following closely on that matter, I would like to hear your thoughts on what it means these days to be essential worker compared to what it used to be.
Yeah, thank you, Fida, for having me on the show. It's really great to be able to speak to the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung and to you in particular. So to just begin with, when the crisis first started to unfold in February in Germany, Belgium, the United States, it became very clear that governments would have to shut down large parts of the economy. And as part of that, there was actually a process ongoing of thinking about and thinking through what would be considered essential and what would be considered non-essential. And what we often saw was businesses leaping to the front and actually saying, our workers are essential. So GameStore, a company that sells computer games, quickly said, hey, people will be spending more time at home playing computer games, so our workers working in shops are essential. Of course, that didn't fly with the US government at the time. Similarly, at the beginning, lots of people questioned Jeff Bezos's decision to call Amazon warehouse workers essential. But given how the crisis developed, we actually saw a very different picture, that we actually saw, well, this work seems to be essential because people can no longer go and buy various goods and items inside of shops. So people need to receive some goods from somewhere else. So we see a very different scenario there. And then we come to the last category of workers, which I think really epitomizes the crisis at the moment, which are the workers you spoke about, right? And in my article with Sarah Faris, we talk about these workers not as essential workers, but as life-making laborers. They aren't only essential since February or March, they're actually always essential because they make our lives what they are. And often that work is invisible. It takes place, if you're a cleaner, it often takes place during the night, or it takes place in the early hours of the morning. And so most of us don't even come into contact with these workers. And I think what the current crisis has highlighted through the label essential is effectively that these workers exist and that they deserve public visibility. But the question that we need to ask ourselves is, at this moment in time, does the label essential actually work in the interests of those precise workers? And unfortunately, in most cases, the answer will be no.
Thank you, Mark, for the very profound answer. So, since we are shedding light also on the bright aspects, like that things that have been happening lately, we have seen that the current crisis has been a window for opportunity for unions, social movements to organize. And across the globe, we have seen that despite the challenges, health workers, domestic workers, and care workers are seizing the moment just to build power and create more caring society, and they are taking care of each other. So do you think with though they are winning many significant gains, do you think those gains could be permanent? How do you see things in the future?
That is a very good question. Whether they will remain permanent, whether the gains will remain permanent. To begin with, I think what we saw is a real opportunity for the labor movement in the recent months. First and foremost, we saw that the public that has often not seen these workers or taken account of these low-wage workers started coming out and clapping for these workers and started showing their sympathy with these workers. And naturally, as I said before, it also raises the question, how are these workers being paid? What kind of working conditions do they work under? And because a lot of the unions seized the moment and said, look, these workers are working in hazardous working conditions. they're not being paid enough, and they're risking their own health and safety in order to make keep everyone else safe and clean. They should deserve more. It effectively led to hazard pay is one of the gains which workers have made. And secondly, they also have regained new recognition. Now, the question is like, where do we start, to make these gains permanent that have developed during the crisis? And the problem really is that companies, whether it's Lufthansa in Germany or whether it's KLM, Air France, they're getting bailouts, and they're getting bailouts with not, too many strings attached. Actually, what would have had to happen in terms of these bailouts is to say, well, look, how are these workers actually going to get a bailout? Most of these workers continue to be in poverty, continue to work for poverty wages, etc. And if we want to, change the situation into the medium to long run, we'll actually have to find a different way to make those gains permanent. And one of those ways, in terms of making these gains permanent, is really to start at the workplace level. So lots of these workers, as I said, have started working in hazardous conditions. Mm-hmm. And it means like, how have unions actually started to develop or redevelop workplace power, right? That's where it starts, because if you have strong union structures at the workplace, it's less likely that people will catch coronavirus. It's more likely that people will be paid a decent wage. And so unions really need to start there in order to make some of those gains permanent.
Thank you, Mark. So another related question, like knowing that women comprise 70% of health workers globally and even higher shares of care-related occupations such as nursing and other professions that embody care work, like they cannot social distance and do their jobs, and they cannot afford not going to work. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think that the current crisis has a huge gendered element. We cannot neglect the fact, or we cannot oversee the fact that most of the essential workers that work within our economies or that have been labeled essential are women workers. And as we know, women's work is continuously undervalued. Is everything fine? Yeah. It's continuously undervalued, and actually women need a pay rise. Now, to address your question, is like these workers cannot engage in social distancing. So I think that the real solidarity movement was people actually saying, hey, we need to keep social distancing measures, or better said, physical distancing measures, and practice social solidarity. So one element was, of course, the clapping for carers, clapping for cleaners, etc. The second element needs to be really about reevaluating women's work more general in society.
Throughout Europe or throughout the Western world, we find that the lower segments of the labor hierarchy tend to be populated by migrants, and often by racialized migrants. Have you noticed any particular effects on racialized communities in your work?
So that's a very good question. So what we saw at the beginning of the crisis, in particular in the European Union, is that different member states of the European Union were very quick to shut down their borders and close their borders, which meant that a lot of care workers, particularly those working in home care in people's homes, were suddenly caught working in people's homes and couldn't return back to their country, particularly in border areas. If you look to Austria, there were various reports of that occurring, but also if you look to Germany and Romanian workers wanting to return back home. So that was the first phase in which migrant workers were particularly affected by the coronavirus crisis, not being able to return home. If they were working on construction, in care, whatever sector, the borders shutting down had a massive effect on freedom of movement inside of the European Union. The second effect is that suddenly workers were either being furloughed or were being put on leave. And it often was migrant workers or immigrant workers, which were the first ones to go. The third effect was really the essential workers. And a lot of racialized workers, a lot of immigrant and migrant workers were deemed essential or categorized as essential. And here we have the kind of twist in the story that comes particularly from Germany, where the country is on lockdown, and suddenly Germany imports, quote unquote, 10,000 Romanian asparagus pickers. Now, you couldn't have a more perverse picture than that. That isn't what we would call freedom of movement. It's actually abusing, Romanian workers' vulnerable situation of where there's not enough work in Romania, and making them work under horrendous conditions. In Germany. And what we saw very quickly was that it opened up a new fault line, that the workers that suddenly they feared the virus more than they did actually the bosses that they were employed by. So we saw a number of strikes in Germany, in particular, where workers were demanding better housing conditions, where workers were demanding wages, and in many cases, they actually won higher wages and better housing conditions. So I think that looking forward, we will deal with a new kind of way in which migrant work is going to be organized, because it is clear that some of the travel restrictions will be upheld in the coming months. And the question is like, to what extent can the local workforce fill those labor gaps? And that will not be possible, because Germans will not suddenly start picking asparagus unless the economy goes down the drain very quickly. And so there will need to be some forms of like regulated migration in the kind of Gastarbeiter, guest worker schemes that we have seen in previous years, rather than the kind of, business recruitment just of like Romanian workers or Bulgarian workers or whatever types of workers come from Southeast and Central and Eastern Europe.
You're describing maybe almost like a renewal of the guest worker programs of the 60s and 70s. Do those offer an opportunity for organized labor to have a voice at the table early on to demand, things like decent wages, decent benefits, or do you think this will this weaken your hand as worker representatives?
That's a difficult question. I think that the time in which the state did have the capacity to organize such programs is over in some ways, because I think that the kind of neoliberal migration management is very well developed inside of Europe. I also think that the European Union will continue to hold on to one of its 4 basic freedoms, which is freedom of movement. So I don't really think that the scenario of like going to a full-fledged like closed migration system in which you kind of control the inflow and outflow of migration is going to be our future. And fourthly, like, as we all know, migrants will migrate, wherever there are economic opportunities, and there will be jobs, and so people will try to move there, whether they are then deemed illegal or undocumented, or whether they will be working illegal. In terms of the trade unions, I think the trade unions have shown that in the 2015 crisis in Germany in particular, that they supported migrants and refugees coming into Germany. We've seen again, in particular in the fields, we saw traditional trade unions such as IG Bau, which organizes field workers organizing and improving terms and working conditions. And we also saw alternative unions, taking up the baton and helping Romanian field workers to get their wages that they deserve. So I think that there are definitely going to be opportunities for unions to recruit and organize migrant workers more than in the past. But I don't know whether the one system of migration is better than the other one for trade unions.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. How about on a more general level? I mean, you just mentioned the I think it was in Bornheim, the small strike of Romanian asparagus pickers here in Germany, which ultimately did lead to at least some small victories for the workers and some basic, basically winning some basic demands like edible food and getting paid their wages on time. But in general, it would seem to me like the practice of labor organizing relies to a large degree on workers being present in a physical space to both recognize their commonality, build a sense of solidarity, but also just to make plans and strategize. So yourself as a labor organizer, what has been your experience over the last few months? What has the lockdown meant for organized labor? Is it still possible to organize things like strikes? Is bargaining with employers possible? Or has that in fact become much more difficult?
So I think to begin with, I think that the sectors that we're talking about, we need to realize one thing. It's really, these are struggles and these are fights to maintain often what is already written in law, right? So often employers will try to undercut the law or try to, forego the law in any case possible. So these are very basic struggles, and the fact that we still need to fight over some of these basic issues is a very sad state of affairs in 2020, and shows how much space there is to still to move forward. To answer your question, I think that in the first sense we saw that a lot of collective bargaining rounds were being canceled. So because actually workers' weapon to strike was withdrawn from them. So in many cases, like in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, the trade unions there decided to very quickly end their collective bargaining and their negotiations because they weren't able to exert any pressure onto employers. So I think that's important to bear in mind. Now, if you then move it forward, you can ask the question, well, now all the companies, in particular in the private sector, but also in terms of in services, are in a far worse economic situation than they previously had been. So would it perhaps have been better to strike an agreement, shortly before the crisis rather than after the crisis? And the third thing is in terms of organizing, I think organizers have been very innovative in terms of developing new kinds of mechanisms. So to organize workers, so having one-to-one conversations via telephone, having one-to-one conversations via Zoom meetings, organizing union meetings with new unions. In the Czech Republic, we organized one where there were like eight new workers who had signed up a national petition for improved health and safety standards in the care sector, that started a union at their workplace. And there's countless of those examples across the globe where workers have come together to organize new unions. I think the question is like, workers need to be in work and and a large part of like cooperating together in a workplace furnishes the kind of solidarity and furnishes the kind of ability to actually also act together, when the going gets tough. And I think that's what, that will be the crucial ingredient in the future.
So Mark, like going back to what you have mentioned before, like most of the workers that work at the bottom sectors of the segmented labor market and like those who are paid low wages, they have been migrants, ethnic minority workers, and also like the system usually reduces them to their economic value, and that's it. So most of them are precariously employed, and many of them live without savings, at the mercy of their employers, denied the right to an adequate standard of living, and living in a very crowded places and without proper housing, water, sanitation, and they don't even have like access to healthcare. Like, speaking of those like migrant and and ethnic minorities, how are those people supposed to social distance? Like, how it's gonna work with those workers?
Yeah, I think the fact is that most poor workers or most low-wage workers haven't been able to socially distance or physically distance, whether it's in their jobs, whether it's in their communities, or whether it's in their housing. I see it myself. The neighborhood that I live in Brussels, it's very popular amongst newly arrived migrants coming in, and it's very difficult for those workers to physically distance from one another, and it makes it even harder if you're in a field, working side by side with complete strangers. The thing is and this is where I think one of the central contradictions comes into at this moment, is that because was such a high awareness amongst workers around the coronavirus crisis, and we saw so many horrible and tragic deaths around it, is that people developed a sense of urgency around like sticking to health and safety and making sure that they would be able to. And because that was the case, we saw some collective action being taken by workers. We saw, whether it was formal or informal, workers putting pressure onto their employers in order to ensure physical distancing measures. And that's why it's so important that even now, whilst countries are easing the measures, that actually like those on the left and those in the trade union movement continue to say, well, the virus hasn't been contained. The second wave is going to be very possible. So actually the same measures have to apply. And there we come to real conflict over the labor process of how work is being conducted, of, like who has control over the labor process. And I think that represents a unique opportunity for trade unions on the question of health and safety.
So, one thing that we have heard lately, that there are many applications were developed where employees can report like about their work conditions and about like lack of equipments or other things. But we have also heard that they are like, it is lack of privacy, and that their employers do have access on the employee's name, their private data, so they fear that it's not safe to use such applications like it happened in the UK and elsewhere. What do you think of this, like kind of applications for safety, but it's actually for surveillance inside like the healthcare system?
I think the whole digital question in the world of work is definitely being reshaped by the coronavirus crisis, insofar as you see these apps being in contact tracing apps being introduced. And in the UK, the unions have been very strongly opposed to workers installing the app because it contains information of personal nature. And I think that we actually have very strong data protection laws. As everybody knows, GDPR is very strong in Europe compared to other parts of the world. But my fear is that employers are actually going to try to collect more information. And as I have written about in my newsletter, there's a number of surveillance companies and tech companies currently investing lots of money into actually developing further mechanisms to also ensure that workers are maintaining social distancing or physical distancing measures. And it's that aspect that should really frighten us. I think that workers because of the nature of because of the way the crisis has unfolded, I think people will be very skeptical of installing these apps and are very likely to not want to sign off all their data. However, the question is like, well, there's so and so many million, unemployed people waiting for a job out there as well. We just got the, figures from Germany. Like there's 169,000 new unemployed people in Germany, and the number will most likely rise in the next few months. So, so people will accept, if unions and the leftists don't intervene, people will accept, these jobs, even if it means giving up their private data.
Thank you, Mark. So I have more questions for you, but I want to make sure, do we have any questions from the audience? So I would hand it over again to Lauren.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Mark. We've got a couple questions from the chat that I'd like to ask you. I'll start out with a fairly straightforward one. I know that you work largely, maybe not exclusively, but largely on the topic of cleaning and sanitation workers. But what about, I mean, we can talk about sanitation workers working in a city institution or maybe in a large office building, but throughout Europe, throughout the world really, one of the largest groups of cleaning workers are people who work in the private homes of middle and upper class employers. A lot of these people don't have contracts, they're isolated. And especially in a country like Brazil, they've actually been some of the hardest hit by the coronavirus pandemic, precisely because of those conditions. So as a union organizer, what can organized labor do to reach these kinds of people? How can these kinds of jobs, or can these kinds of jobs be organized, or is it just too difficult?
Yeah. That's a very good question. First and foremost, we should say that a lot of these domestic workers that work in people's homes have very strong communities often, and often come from migrant communities or are drawn from the same neighborhoods, and so they often have their informal networks and are self-organizing often. And the thing is, they can, that can already lead to improvements. However, I think as unions, we need to, actually fight for, these workers to be recognized as professional workers. You or I might clean our houses, but it's not professional work. The work that these most and predominantly women workers engage in is professional work. And so their skills should be recognized, which means if their skills are recognized, it actually means that, this is the kind of wage that they deserve. Secondly, a lot of this work, should be regularized to the sense that so that these women actually, get social security or, get unemployment benefits, etc. So I think that's important. And thirdly, we actually need to start to have collective bargaining structures. Now, it sounds very kind of policy, kind of wonky to say it, but the problem really for unions is like, whom do you bargain with? You can't really bargain like house by house if these workers are directly employed by by a homeowner or by the person living in the home. So we actually need to create very different collective bargaining structures. There's been massive advances through ILO Convention 189, and the International Domestic Workers Federation and UNI fight side by side for domestic workers. And we put out we even managed to get the employers, to put out a joint statement with us, ensuring that, some of these workers are going to get paid. And in particularly in Italy, the Italians unions actually managed to include them in the Cura Italia, in the agreement that was struck, so that they would be considered essential workers and that they would be able to maintain their rights. So there have been some progresses on that, but it's a difficult sector, and we all need to really continue building the unions in that sector.
Thanks a lot, Mark. One more question I'd like to throw at you. It's kind of a tricky one, but I think you're well qualified to answer it. given your background in international labor organizing. So another viewer on our stream asks us what we actually mean by global solidarity. And obviously, as one of the hosts of the show, I should probably be prepared to answer this question. But as our guest, and as someone who has a lot of experience organizing labor struggles around the European Union, and if I remember correctly, even in countries outside of the European Union, I would be interested to hear your take. What would a strategy of global solidarity or a global strategy for labor look like that's not divided along national or ethnic lines or by industry? Obviously, this is a project that your union is very invested in. So I'd love to get your take on what a term like that means to you.
Okay. So foremost is like when we look back to, Karl Marx, and who said, workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains. It's in that spirit that, the left and trade unions really should be acting. And today, I think there's like three fault lines of how we could develop global solidarity. The first one is really the North-South divide in our world, the global North and the global South. And what we see far too often is that industrial production and manufacturing companies, move to the global South in order to, decrease wages, decrease working conditions, and boost their profits. And yet often upstream in the global North, the core workforce in the same company will actually be fine with, offshoring certain production as long as it doesn't affect their job. So we actually need to develop a kind of redistributive solidarity that not only talks about hey, the typical kind of German Standortlogik, but that actually sees workers within the same company or within the same supply chains as part of the same working class. So we need a form of global industrial unionism, which is very difficult to achieve given the different union cultures which are out there. But I think that workers have the capacity to develop that. The second one is really to think about the division between the 99% and the 1%. So at the moment we're really talking about Jeff Bezos perhaps even becoming a trillionaire, right? And at the same time, I was reading this book where it said American workers have actually not improved their standard of living, in real terms since the late 1970s and have had stagnant wages. So we need to think about how do we tackle global inequality, right, as one of the manifestations of capitalism. And there, I think, the trade union movement really needs to put itself at the front and center of this question. And I think that's one way that we really can develop global solidarity. It's between all these different people across the globe that we have. And the third one, I think, is taking up the bigger political questions of climate change, social justice, war and imperialism, which need to be which need to ground us in a politics of saying that, an injustice to one is an injury to one is an injury to all, because that is a basic trade union slogan. So, if we are serious about global solidarity, we cannot be quiet about the murder of George Floyd in the United States. We cannot be silent about so many crimes that are being, committed across the globe, and actually need to see ourselves as part of a global social justice movement.
Thank you, Mark. So one last question. So just to wrap things up. Workers on the front lines do deserve our applause and our gratitude, but they definitely also do deserve better working conditions. So this question is specific and might need specific answer. And they do deserve an adequate protection equipment and good pay that recognizes their efforts, in saving lives, risking their lives to save ours. So what do you think would be, which practices and measures, specific measures, would you think should be deployed in the future to build systems that genuinely care about workers? What kind of system we need for the future for workers?
Yeah. So I think if you look at the sectors that we spoke about, care, in Germany, like 5% of care workers are members of unions. If you look to private sector union membership in the United States, it's around 7%. Like you see these figures and you think like, oh my God, like this is like, there's not even a floor to begin with, right? There's, it's just abyss. So what we actually need to talk about is like creating a floor, right? How do you create a floor? A floor is being created like through, sectoral collective bargaining, which means that like the companies cannot undercut each other on the cost of labor any longer, which is happening all across our countries, between North and South, as I described, or between West and East, etc. So that needs to be ensured. The second thing is it's not just enough to have like, a good sectoral collective agreement, but what we actually need is workplace democracy, that workers have a say on how, companies are being run, on how things are being produced, on how and how the profits are being redistributed that the company makes. And if we're talking about that, we need to be clear about the fact that in many countries, that is being equated with, like the Germans, talk about Mitbestimmung. Like, well, and in the United Kingdom, in Britain, Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell were talking about a similar system. In the United States, Bernie Sanders wanted to introduce, I think, a Workplace Democracy Act, which was also going to talk about it. And even the Financial Times has started to speak about, stakeholder capitalism instead of like shareholder capitalism. So I think as the left, we say, oh yeah, that's just like, reformist stuff. But even getting to that in order to create the floor through sectoral collective bargaining, create workplace democracy is, the next step. And then thirdly, workers' control.
Thanks a lot. And I think that's all the time we have today. So thanks again, Mark, for your insights. And thanks to everyone who took part in the conversation today. My name is Fidel Zanin, and next to me is Lauren Balhorn. Please don't forget to follow us on Twitter at Rosa-Lux_Global, and also feel free to leave us any comments or suggestions for the future topics here on Facebook or on Twitter under the hashtag Global Solidarity. Also, we will be back in 2 weeks on the 17th of June at 3 p.m. Central European Time with Dr. Ndongo Sambasila, Senegalese development economist, researcher at the West Africa office of the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung in Dakar. We will be talking with Dr. Ndongo about global finance, global inequality, and the fate of the global South. Thanks a lot and see you next time.